there's a lot of research about how income is related to outcomes for children, like how well they do in school, how well they're doing on social indicators, and there's a lot of research about how class background and family income influences parenting behaviors, but there's very little about how parents are actually talking with their children about these issues in the context of their family lives.
Dr. Feigenberg is a developmental psychologist whose work focuses on children's social, emotional, and ethical development. Currently, she serves as a research director at Making Caring Common, a project of the Harvard Graduate School of Education focused on helping parents and educators raise caring, ethical kids.
Before we get started, I'm going to give you a pop quiz. So not only did you come out on a cold night, but I'm going to ask you to answer some questions. You do not have to tell me your answers. You don't even have to keep track as we go through. But since we're talking about privilege, particularly around class, I want us all to sort of be grounded in the room together and have a shared understanding of what we're actually talking about. So I'm going to read some statements and just think to yourself if this is true about you or not, or the extent to which it might be true about you. You might be somewhere on a range. Okay, so the first one, there are stores that market especially to people from my social class. I can afford to seek medical help when I need it. I can afford to provide child care for my children when I cannot be home with them, or would be able to if you had children. It is likely that my career and financial success will be attributed to my hard work. When I purchase things with a check or a credit card, my appearance doesn't create problems. If I wish to send my children to private school, I could. If I'm asked to go out to lunch with a friend, I don't have to turn them down because I can't afford the restaurant. I do not have to rely on public transportation. I can afford to own a car. If I am charged with a crime, I will be able to afford a competent attorney and will not have to rely on a court-appointed lawyer. Oops. And the last one, I am able to save enough money to ensure that my family and I will not go hungry if I unexpectedly lose my job. So, why did I ask you to do this? All of these statements get at how much privilege you may or may not have based on the social class that you have in this country at this point in time. So since we're going to be talking about class, and I'm going to sort of go through and talk about the terms that we're going to use in a minute, but I just want us all to think about what that means for our own lives and for the lives of children if they were in our families or part of our everyday life. So let's talk about some terms for a second. When I say privilege, I mean the rights or benefits that are available to a person or a group of people that are above and beyond what other people may have. When we talk about class or social class, we're talking about people who have the same position within our economic system. And that can be based on jobs or professions. It can be based on education level. It can be based on family wealth and a variety of other factors. Income is the amount of money that a family, individual, or household brings in any given year. And income inequality is the extent to which that family or household income is distributed unevenly across a population within the United States is what we're talking about here tonight. Do you have any questions about that? Does that make sense? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what income looks like in this country. Again, just to give us a grounding before we start hearing what parents have to say. So in the United States, the median income, which means half of the people make more than this and half of the people make less for households, is $53,000 a year. But you can see that it is not evenly distributed. There's a lot of income inequality and disparity in this country. And in fact, 5% of the population in the US makes more than $196,000 a year. That's the top 5%. And there's a lot of talk about all of these different gradations and where people fall, and some questioning about that. So that's for the country, but different regions of the country, different states and different metropolitan areas have different distributions. So just to give you a sense of what it looks like in Massachusetts, the median income is higher, so it's almost $67,000 per year for a household in Massachusetts, and the 95th percentile is higher as well. It's up at $239,000. So 95% of people in the state of Massachusetts make less than that, and 5% make more than that. So again, think about where you fall on this distribution and what that means for your daily life, what that means for the things that you do, and how you think about and talk about what that allows you to do as you move through the world. So when I think about the context for talking with parents and thinking about how parents talk with their kids about income inequality and about class privilege, I also think about the current context that we live in. So within this country, income inequality is growing by most measures and has been for the last 30 years. And looks as if it will continue to grow in that way as well. So there is a growing divide between how much money rich people have and how much money poor people have, and there's very fewer and fewer people who sort of fall in the middle, but the gap is growing and the disparity between those groups is widening. There's been a lot of talk after Election Day in the last month and a half about the role that class played in the election and how the amount of money people have and the class that they identify with shapes their views about the world, about the government, and about the status of this country and where people want it to be. So that is very alive in the conversations that we were having with parents and also that I hope we'll have here tonight. The privileged class has historically been in control of the government in the US, and maybe that's more true than ever. There were reports saying that the new incoming cabinet of the Trump administration, there's 13 people currently named, and their combined wealth is more than 1/3 of the entire country. So again, always been the case, but maybe even more so now, and that is relevant to our conversations as well. So there's a generation of children that are growing up in this climate where wealth is becoming, there's more disparity in wealth, and it's part of the sort of public discourse about how people are getting along, how people are thinking about issues, and how people are able or not to talk to each other. But at the same time, there's very little research that's been done about how parents talk with their children about these issues. There's a lot of research about how income is related to outcomes for children, like how well they do in school, how well they're doing on social indicators, and there's a lot of research about how class background and family income influences parenting behaviors, but there's very little about how parents are actually talking with their children about these issues in the context of their family lives. So we got interested in that. So the questions that really have guided our research are, why should parents talk about class privilege with their children in the first place? Why is that important? Do parents see it as important? And why is it something that they should talk about? Are parents talking with their children about class privilege? And if they are, how are they talking about it? What are the themes that are coming up? And then what challenges do they face in having these conversations? So what I want to do is sort of walk through these and give you some sense of how parents have shared their thoughts with us, both in terms of some categories we've come up with, as well as some actual direct quotes from them so you can get a sense of their language. Just to give you a sense of where we have drawn our information for this work, we have a national sample of parents, and I can tell you about a little bit more about that at the end when I talk about making caring common. But we did a survey, an online survey with over 3,000 parents that was representative of national demographics in terms of race, income, and region. So we really wanted to make sure we were hearing from people all over the country from a wide range of backgrounds. Then we followed up after we did our survey with interviews and focus groups. Again, parents all around the country. We've talked with over 45 people. The majority of the people who have been interested in talking with us are mostly white upper-income mothers, but there is some diversity within that based on race, gender, and class. And we have a lot more variation in terms of where in the country people come from and also their political affiliation. So we have people who identify strongly as Democrats, strongly as Republicans, and people who are in the independent realm as well. Before I tell you about what we have heard so far, do you have any questions about the things that I've shared so far? Okay, I will keep going. So there's 4 things that I want to talk about tonight in terms of what we have heard from parents so far in our conversations. One is that overwhelmingly parents do think it's important to talk about class privilege with their kids, and there's a couple of reasons for that that I will go into. When parents talk with their kids about class privilege, they're framing privilege as being on a continuum of choice, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. There's a lot in the conversations with parents, both in their conversations with us and what they tell us about the conversations that they have with their children. There's a lot that goes unspoken or unnamed, or places where the conversation kind of falls silent. And that was a recurring theme. And mostly parents feel that these are really hard conversations to have, because they are. None of us are very practiced in them. And parents are really looking for guidance in how to talk with their children about these issues in a way that feels authentic and meaningful to them. So I'll talk about that as well, and then I'll give you some implications and next steps. So the first thing, parents think it's important to talk about class privilege. So on our survey, over 70% of parents indicated that it was important to them, and it actually varied, or I should say increased, with family income. So as families reported that they themselves had higher incomes, they were more likely to say that it was important to talk with their kids about class privilege. And they had a couple of reasons for saying that, or they told us. One is they feel really strongly that it's their responsibility as a parent to be talking with their children about these issues. For one, they feel like children need to understand that this is the reality of the world. Parents were very clear that they know that there are gaps between how much money different families make, and that that plays itself out in a lot of ways. And they wanted to make sure that their children understood the reality of the world that they were living in, and that the world that they would end up working in and raising their own families in, should they raise families. Parents talked a lot about how they viewed the understanding of class privilege that their children have as also helping them to be successful. So part of the reality of the world that parents were talking about is that the workforce is becoming more and more diverse and more international, and that their kids were going to have to be able to interact with people who came from different backgrounds from them, particularly in terms of how much money they had. So they felt that the better understanding their own children had of what it was like to be in situations with people who were different from them, the more successful they would go off and be in those settings. And then lastly, parents felt really strongly that these are conversations that should happen at home. They should start at home. They may happen in school. They may happen in other settings, but that home was the place where they really wanted their kids to be hearing about these issues first and foremost. Parents also said that it was important to them to talk with their kids about class privilege because it helped their kids be grateful. And they really felt very strongly that they wanted to have their kids feel a sense of gratitude and appreciation for what they have. So this parent says, I want my own child to understand that the circumstances she lives in are more fortunate ones than the circumstances that other children live in. And a parent said this over and over and over again. I want them to be grateful for what we have. There was a fear that children were going to grow up being spoiled or entitled. And parents felt that in talking with their children about the differences in money that families had or made, that they could help their children be more appreciative of the privilege that they themselves had. Parents also thought it was important to talk about class privilege because understanding that there is a privilege also promotes empathy for people who may not have the same amount that they do. So this parent says, I really want my child to understand how other people live, and if nothing else, to have a sense of empathy for others and a sense of justice and fairness. And we heard this from parents over and over and over again as well, that empathy is a really important thing in child raising, that they want their children to be caring, respectful, and ethical out in the world, and that a big part of that, again, was understanding the privilege that they had based on how much money their family was making. And then the last piece that we heard in why it was important for parents in talking with their children about class privilege was that they wanted their children to feel empowered to take action and to see it actually as a responsibility that they had as well. So this parent said, we need to raise little citizens that are more conscious and conscientious of the fact that there's differences between people based on incomes and that things aren't always equal. the haves that have the voice, they should be acknowledging it and maybe teaching their children these things, because then I feel like we could solve some of the problems. So in acknowledging the privilege that they had, they wanted their children to go out into the world and be aware of that so that they could try to take action to change it, and that that was really part of their responsibility. So the second thing we hear from parents is that they're framing class privilege as being on a continuum of choice. And I'll tell you a little bit what I mean about that. So there was 4 ways that people talked about this. On the one hand, parents talked about privilege as not being a choice at all. That the amount of money that they had or made, that the opportunities that they had were really about luck and good fortune. And they used those words a lot. We're lucky we ended up this way, we're lucky we're able to have these things. And they felt that in the explanations that they were giving to their children, that they were using words about circumstances happening to them or happening to other people. They talked a lot about life isn't always fair, so some people don't have as much as other people. Everyone is doing the best that they can. They wanted their children to understand that some people sort of fall on hard times or don't have luck on their side, but that they might be trying hard anyway. And again, similar to that feeling of gratitude, they wanted their children to understand that they were blessed by being in the situations that they were in. And again, in comparison to other people and having more than other people have. Some people who talked about there being a choice framed the choice as being around working hard or having a strong work ethic. So parents would talk about some people choose to work harder than other people, or some people choose to pursue education and really value education, which helps them have more, and they would tell the stories of how their families got to the places that they were in those kinds of ways. These parents talked a lot about opportunity is out there if you go and find it. If you put yourselves in the right situations, you will be able to move forward, you will be able to be more upwardly mobile, and it will help you find a way out of the cycle. And some families felt this way based on their own experience of growing up in one class, one kind of social class and moving into another. And other families felt very strongly that they had gotten where they were because of the work that they had put in and the education that they had, and they hoped the same would be true for their children. A third way of talking about choice was really about parents and families spending money in different ways. So when confronted with trying to explain to children why some families have more money than others do, and particularly why their family may have more or less than another family, there was a lot of conversation around, well, different families make different choices. We may not choose to go on a fancy vacation, but other families may choose to do that. Some families choose to live in smaller houses than other families do. And parents talked a lot about how their framing of situations in this way helped them not pass on some sense of judgment about different lifestyles and the way that other families were spending money or showing the amount of money that they had. And they hoped that their children would interpret that as well and not sort of be biased towards other people based on their lifestyle choices. It was also acknowledging that their own children may make different choices from them when they grew up. And a lot of parents talked about, you know, they want the best for their child, but that they don't want their children to feel pressured to be in these high-powered professions if they wanted to go more into public service or into the public sector where they might make less money. The last piece around choice was a group of families that really talked about how having choice itself is a privilege. And they were very explicit in talking with their children, or in telling us how they talk with their children, about explaining to their kids that not all groups of people have access to the same resources, not everybody is availed to the same opportunities, and that there are systems and structures in place and that have been in place over time that perpetuate inequities, that keep certain groups of people in power, that oppress other groups of people, and that these inequities are perpetuated over time. Some families felt that this was a really important part of the conversations that they were having with their kids, and they wanted it to be very clear to their children that this was the way the world worked, and that they understand that from a very early age. So even as parents, yeah. I'll repeat the question about whether we also measured assets. We did not measure assets. We only measured household income. And we asked people to report their own perceived social class, because research shows and our findings validated that, which is people will report their household income, and I showed you the distributions, but everybody tends to report their perceived social class as pushing more towards the middle. So people in lower income brackets see themselves as middle class, and people in higher income brackets see themselves as middle class, even when their incomes are very different. And we talked a lot about how to get at or whether to ask about assets and wealth, and decided not to go down that path. We do have some information about people's educational attainment, which is another sort of characteristic that plays into social class. Okay. So even as parents were telling us that they think it's important to talk about class privilege with their kids, they are talking about class privilege in these variety of ways around choice. There's also a lot that they told us about that does not get talked about and that goes unspoken. And I'll tell you about a couple of the things that they said. So one big thing is they said, parents overwhelmingly said that they don't bring up the topic of class privilege until their kids ask them questions. And that their kids ask them a lot of questions about visible material things in their everyday lives, like the different sizes of houses that people have, the shoes and clothes that people wear, the vacations that families go on, and a lot of questions about seeing homeless people on the street. I think that's the most common one that parents would bring up over and over and over again. Parents felt somewhat prepared sometimes to talk about those things, and I'll tell you more about the challenges that they experienced in a minute. But they really didn't know how to talk about more abstract topics and things that kids would bring home as situations that parents felt had class and had family income at its core, but didn't know how to name or how to talk about. So this parent said, kids just notice these things. They notice the kids that have to be on the free and reduced price lunch lines. They figure out the kids who are in the low reading group because maybe they haven't had the experiences reading at home. I think that they figure these things out, but I don't know how to. So parents would tell us that their children would bring home these situations from school, and parents would immediately feel uncomfortable because they knew that there was a class or a money issue at the core, but they didn't know how to name that, and so oftentimes they didn't. We also had a lot of parents who told us that they didn't know how to name the class issues that were coming up in conversations with their kids because it wasn't present around them in the same kind of way. So a lot of the families we talked to live in very homogeneous, very high income communities. So the income distribution that I showed you was even more concentrated, and families who are making upwards of $500,000 a year were the low income families in their communities. And they didn't know how to talk with their kids about that. So this parent said, we drive around in our Honda, which is a totally lovely functional car, and we see all these Teslas and BMWs and fancy cars. And our kid is thinking, well, why aren't we rich enough to have that? When really the question should be, why don't other people have a reliable means of transportation? But it's hard to have that conversation when everyone they see has something that can be termed as more than you. So parents felt like they didn't know how to bring up the spectrum that they wanted kids to be able to see when their kids were feeling like, relatively speaking to other people in their communities, they didn't have as much money. And so parents felt at a loss for that. And then the last piece about going unspoken is, even in our conversations with parents, whether it was an interview or a focus group setting, parents who voluntarily came to us to talk about these issues, even within the context of our conversations, there were places where parents would kind of go silent on the topic and revert to coded language or proxies for class. There was a lot of talk about, especially in a school setting, those kids and their behavior, or it will bring down the academic quality. They talked about lifestyle and culture and these issues, and a lot of parents who would say, you know what I mean, but didn't really have the words or feel confident in finding the language to talk about the real class or money issues that were at the foundation of the issue that they were raising. And that was really striking in a lot of the conversations that we had as well. Any questions about that? Okay. So the last piece is that parents feel challenged in having these conversations with their kids. They feel like they didn't have a lot of practice, and they really were looking for guidance about how to engage their children in conversations about class privilege. And there were a couple of questions that parents would raise. So one big area of concern was, can my children understand what I'm even talking about? There were a lot of conversations about what this looked like developmentally, and obviously the conversations that parents would have with a 4-year-old would be very different than with an 8-year-old than with a 16-year-old. So parents were concerned about using language that was really accessible to their children in a developmental way. They wanted to find ways to talk with their kids about issues related to money that were related to their kids' lives and felt embedded in their kids' experiences and didn't sound like parents were lecturing them. But they also wanted to present enough information so that they felt like their kids had a more nuanced and complicated understanding about how these issues were at play in their everyday lives. Parents had a hard time figuring out, or told us they have a hard time figuring out, how to start the conversation. A lot of parents said it doesn't come up naturally in conversation, and that they didn't want to make it an issue where it wasn't. So again, there were some situations where parents felt children were asking them questions. The parents themselves felt like there was an issue around class or family income at the core, but they didn't know how to name it. Or they were living in these communities where children weren't exposed to people who had real differences in terms of family income or class than them, and so they didn't know how to bring it up. And then this last one, which I briefly mentioned before, parents feeling like their families have privilege, but their children didn't feel that way based in the communities where they lived. I talked with one mother who lived in a suburban sort of new development in a western state, and she said, you know, her house was 4,700 square feet, and her kids thought their house was small because most of the houses in their community were 10,000 feet or above or bigger. And people were going on these fancy vacations, and her kids weren't, and so her kids were complaining all the time about how they didn't have that much money. And she felt so stuck in how to explain to them that they actually have way more money than most people in the country, but relative to the people right around them, they really didn't. And she didn't know how to talk with her kid about that. The question was whether parents felt like they could go to other communities where there were people who had less money than them. Some parents talked about how they didn't feel like they had a choice. So we live where we live. It's a very homogeneous community, and the only way we could expose our children to people who have different amounts of money from them is if we moved, and we're not going to do that. So some people felt like they didn't know how to do that within the context of their community. Other people were really searching for ways to help their children have experiences with people who they perceived as different from them. We had conversations that I'm not talking about tonight, but we had a lot of conversations about what their schools were like. And that was another place where parents felt like their children weren't experiencing diversity necessarily in their schools. So they were trying to find volunteer experiences for them or trips where they could go and have a different experience. But they didn't want it to be a superficial kind of, we drop in to see this and then we leave. And they really didn't know, and were looking for ways to help them figure out how to expose their children to these different kinds of experiences. Okay. Parents also expressed some concern about how to navigate the boundaries of these conversations. One piece was feeling that conversations about income and about class are very personal. And they wanted their children to understand that they were conversations you have at home, but not necessarily to broadcast out to the rest of the world. And were sort of unsure about how to have that conversation with their kid. But at the same time, they didn't want their kids to feel like it was a dirty secret that would perpetuate the stigma. Parents were very clear that they recognize that class is not an issue that we as a society have a lot of practice in talking about, and it feels like there's a lot of stigma about that. They didn't want to contribute to that by making their children feel like it was a secret that they had to keep, but also didn't want their children to go out and broadcast very personal information about their families. And then a lot of people talked about not wanting their children to feel guilty or feel bad about the amount of money that they had, and were worried that if they explained it to their children in a certain kind of way or talked about the systems that perpetuate inequality over time, that their children were going to somehow feel bad about who they were. And parents were really nervous about that, and it, I think, inhibited them from having conversations with their kids in some situations. Parents were also nervous about exposing their children to too much, or as one parent said, how do we, when do you start teaching your children about despair? And this parent said, for all of the amount of time I try to prevent her from exposure to violence and cigarette smoking and bullying, here I am exposing her to a world that is a really, really hard world. And is she ready for that? And by putting too much of that on her as a 10-year-old to carry, to understand that mental illness plays a role in income inequity and that the color of your skin may dictate your income or may play a role in where you live, is that placing an undue weight? And a lot of parents talked about this, like, how do I share this information in a way that isn't going to be scary or overwhelming? Some parents recognized, even as they were saying this, that the choice to talk with children about privilege or not in itself is a privilege, and would talk very clearly as they were sort of narrating their own concerns. They would say, and I recognize that not all families have a choice about whether or not to talk about this because it is their lived experience in a very different way. And then finally, the last kind of challenge that parents experienced was when their beliefs and values about talking about class privilege with their kid comes into conflict with other values that they hold very deeply. And the biggest one was wanting their kids to have the best opportunities that they could. So this parent said it's hard because you want to give your kids the best, and how the world defines the best, and I'm guilty of it like everyone else, is in the things that are involved with class. And I want to take those. I want my children to touch all the continents. I want them to go on a nice Caribbean vacation, not because I want to keep up with the Joneses as much as I want them to experience everything life has to offer. And parents talked a lot about this in terms of feeling like they themselves thought it was wrong that there was so much income inequality in this country. It's unfair that some people have more than other people. They wanted their children to actively work against this and felt that they had some responsibility to do that. And at the same time, they wanted their kids to have the opportunities, to have the resources, and to have the experiences that tend to come along with living a more privileged lifestyle. And they really were torn about that. Okay, so knowing all of that, what are some implications for parents, and then also what are we going to do next? So the implications that I see for parents, and I'll tell you in a second a little bit more about what we do at Making Caring Common, but when we do our research, we always think about, well, what are the things that we can share with parents, and some recommendations, some tips, and some strategies that we can offer. And so these are some preliminary ones that we are sort of batting around and working on. One is, I think, in the confusion about where to start with these conversations and parents feeling unsure about how to initiate conversations with their kids, that the most important thing is really to start where the kids are and to build from there. So as children are asking questions, as children are bringing up issues, to figure out what their level of understanding already is and to scaffold it so that they have some more information, so that they have some more language to use, and to gradually build on the conversations that you're having. And a great starting point for that is really to ask kids what they think. So a lot of times kids are wondering about something, but they already have a hypothesis, or they already have some theory about what might be happening. And to start from there and get a sense again of what kids' working knowledge is, what their lived experience is, can help build the conversation moving forward. One thing that came up so strongly was that parents feel like their kids don't have a nuanced understanding of sort of the spectrum that families can be on. And I think it's important for parents to help kids think about that spectrum and kind of to zoom out and then zoom back in and think about their own lived experience, and then think about what all of the range of possibilities might be, and then to come back in to think about their own community, their own school, and what they're most familiar with. I think it's really important for parents to reflect on their own experiences in terms of the class background that they grew up in, how they have gained access or not to opportunities and to resources, and to reflect on the impact that that's had in their own lives so that they're more aware of what they're bringing into conversations with their kids. Parents talked a lot about feeling isolated in these conversations because of the stigma. So I think it's really important for parents to seek support from other parents and to have these conversations more openly in the ways that we do with other topics, like how much sleep your kids get or what food they're eating. I think we need to have more practice having these conversations with other families. And then finally, to pay attention and be attuned to how these kinds of issues are playing out in the school setting, and what it looks like when there are groups of children who are coming from very different family income backgrounds, or what it looks like when they're not, and the conversations that kids might be having and the pressures that they might be feeling in the school setting. So I will end on that note and just give you a heads up that we are going, this is the start of our sharing of this work that we've been doing. We're going to be releasing a report about how parents talk about inequality and economic integration within schools later this winter or early spring. And all of the work that we do at Making Caring Common is really aimed at helping parents and educators raise caring and ethical kids. So we do research on topics like income inequality that have caring, a concern for others, and a commitment to the greater good at their core. We try to get our work out into the national conversation, so we do a lot of media-focused work, and every time we release some of our research, it's always accompanied with strategies and tips that parents can use, resources and activities that schools can use to integrate into the work that they're doing with students, and compilation of resources that people can access if they're looking for more information. So I encourage you to keep an eye out for that information early in the spring. You can find more information about the other work that we do on our website, and I would be happy to follow up with people if you want to email me at some other time. But I'm also happy to answer questions right now. Yeah?
So you mentioned that you looked at these results depending on the political affiliation. So what difference did you see?
So we're still looking at that on the survey level. There are some differences so one thing that was clear is that regardless of any characteristic about parents, whether it's political affiliation, income level, education level, parents overwhelmingly think it is important to talk about these issues with their kids, and report trying at least to talk with their kids about these issues, but feel stuck in some different kinds of ways. We are hoping to look more at if there are differences in how the conversations are going based on what beliefs or political affiliations parents might be bringing into those conversations, but we just haven't gotten there yet. That's a great question about how parents are talking with their kids about transfer of wealth over generations. The parents did not talk about that very much in the interviews explicitly in terms of having those conversations with their kids. I think that parents were very clear, the high wealth parents, did acknowledge in less explicit language that their children would always have a safety net to fall back on and would not have to worry about the resources that they would have in their lives. And parents were very clear that their children had and would have an array of opportunities available to them, and in some ways didn't want their kids to know that too much, and were more concerned about their kids feeling entitled or spoiled by the things that they did have. And so we didn't ask them about whether they talked about transfer of wealth, but my assumption would be that part of the reason that they're not naming those conversations is because they didn't want their children to expect too much and not work hard or pursue education anyway.
Did you look at anything pertaining to like religion, either how that like people fell in certain demographics, or perspectives, or like the language that they use to describe their values and talking about equality?
We didn't ask explicitly about religion and how that played in to parents' language that they used. Some parents brought it up and did talk about, especially in thinking about how they talk with their children about the importance and responsibility of giving back. I think that was the most common place where people would reference religion, and the feeling that, in our community or based on our religious beliefs, it is very important to us that we are generous with other people, that we take care of people who may not have as much as we do, and that it is our responsibility to somehow contribute to our community in a financial way. So parents would reference religion in those kinds of ways, but we didn't explicitly ask them about it. Yeah.
So I'm curious, over the kind of the body of findings that you've presented, it seems like most of them come more so from the interviews than from the surveys. Mm-hmm. And I'm just kind of curious if that's correct, and then if it is, then if you're concerned about or think about the bias that it seems like you have the sample of people who chose to participate. For a number of reasons, it seems like they're probably more actively thinking about these issues than other people, and therefore they're happy to talk about how they're thinking about these issues and how they therefore talk to their children. But then also just like the more fundamental point that that this is about conversations about diversity and the limited diversity of those families that you're talking to. I mean, we know nothing about what these conversations look like, at least from what we've looked at today in low-income communities, right? And so shouldn't that be a big part of this conversation?
Absolutely. So yes, you are absolutely correct that the findings that I presented here are primarily from the interviews and the focus groups. We have data from the survey that is a much more diverse sample in terms of family income and everything else. And we are still trying to figure out what some of the patterns are in there. We have like the big overview points about parents thinking it's important to talk about these issues regardless of where they come from, and some of the challenges that they feel in having those conversations. But we want to spend some more time looking at how all of those characteristics come into play with each other. And to your point about this being a skewed interview sample, because people are volunteering to talk to us about these issues, so they're already thinking about that. Absolutely, the pump is already primed for them, and they were very eager to talk about it. And we do not have the range in terms of family income. So one thing we are moving towards as we continue this line of work is getting a more varied interview sample in terms of family income. And part of the reason why we chose to frame the results that we have so far in terms of privilege is because we realized that our interview sample was a very privileged population. So we felt like we could think about and listen for how they were talking about privilege in a very different way than we might frame questions if we were asking them to families that have less privilege. Does that answer that? Respond to it? Yeah.
Do we know anything about what the kids think in terms of, are they accepting these explanations, or do they make them feel sad, or they want to do something about them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the research that we do at Making Caring Common, we almost always have a student perspective, a parent perspective, and a teacher perspective, because we do our research primarily in schools. We did a pilot study for this research that we're doing now with parents, and we asked kids a very small number of questions. And mostly we asked them if their parents talked to them about differences in family income, and we asked them about the amount of diversity by income that they perceived in their school setting. And kids were really split, actually. About 50% of the kids told us that their parents talked to them about it, and about 50% of the kids told us that their parents didn't. But those are different kids than the parents that we asked here, so we don't really know how that plays itself out. It's something I think would be interesting to look at moving forward, because some of the other research that we've done on other topics tells us that the messages that kids are hearing from their parents is really different than the messages parents think they're sending, and so it would be interesting to know from this if that's a similar dynamic at play. Yeah.
Have you looked at any models outside the U.S. as a comparison? Because it seems that in the U.S. Suburbs often lead to, there's a lot of segregation in terms of the communities you get, whilst other parts of the world there's maybe more of a mix because of how cities and infrastructure is built. So I wondered if you've thought about that, but also if people in the interviews are aware of that, because it seems surprising in a sense that people don't know how to expose their children, because you don't need to go very far and it's all around us if you're looking for it. So it's somehow surprising to hear that.
Yeah. I have not looked at international models or parallels, and I agree that the way cities and metropolitan areas in the U.S. are constructed present unique situations, and I also think it differs depending on region of the country, right? So sort of the East Coast cities, because they're older, are more diverse in a metropolitan sense, but some of the cities in the South, in the Southwest, and even on the West Coast are much more sprawled. And I think it was in those places where parents were feeling like, or talking to us about having a harder time figuring out how to help their kids have experiences with people who are different from them, when they really only see sort of what's in their immediate neighborhood, and then they drive in a car to go somewhere else, and then they see what's in their immediate neighborhood. I think in more metropolitan areas, kids have more experience because they're traveling around in different kinds of ways, and people are coming in and out. At the same time, I think that's another place where parents are not talking about things that they see, and also not always seeing the difference that might be right in front of them. So I gave a talk about this work at a private school, a very expensive private school in a very affluent community, and parents raised that exact same question, and they said, well, how can I help my kids be exposed to people who are different from them when we live in this very homogeneous, segregated community? And while we were having the conversation, the library that we were in was being cleaned by the cleaning crew of the school, all of whom were people of color. And I thought, well, you do have people who are different from you in your everyday life, but you're not necessarily noticing them or articulating it to your children and having conversations about that and what that means. So I think there's lots of opportunities that parents aren't necessarily seeing, and I would love to find ways to help sort of point that out to them. Yeah.
I guess, did you get any insight from the parents about at what point in their lives did their own views of privilege sort of become solidified? Because I guess I'm sort of wondering about what sort of opportunities there are for intervention with a parent who, you know, is continuing to teach their, you know, their child some super meritocratic view of like wealth and class being a function of like, you know, of strictly hard work and, you know, moral integrity. Like at what point, I guess, do they identify, you know, that sort of, that crystallization sort of happening, and where's the opportunity to sort of intervene and to you know, educate? Yeah,
it's such a great question about intervention points. So we didn't ask parents that question explicitly in terms of sort of where their view on this came from, but some parents talked about it in a couple of different ways. One thing that was always striking was when parents felt like they had grown up in a very different class situation than they were raising kids in. And usually when parents were talking about that, they had been upwardly mobile. And some parents felt very strongly that they had grown up having a sense of either a strong working class identity or growing up in a community that had much higher rates of poverty, and that their kids were not having that experience at all, and they were sad about that. And they felt that that was a real loss, and they wanted their kids to have and experience a sense of need that they didn't have. And they didn't want to sort of artificially construct it, but at the same time, they were looking for ways to expose their kids to a little more economic hardship. So for those parents, that there was a turning point in there. Some of the parents that didn't have that experience, but had a very sort of meritocratic view of things, talked about how they felt challenged when their kids raised questions that might contradict their logic. So for example, the parents who talked about framing privilege as luck or as choice, not as a choice, as luck or as good fortune or as being blessed. And they said, some parents told us stories about their kids saying, well, does that mean that people who don't have as much as us aren't blessed? And for people who brought a religious angle to it, they would say, and the kids would ask, does that mean that God doesn't pay attention to them in the same way or isn't taking care of them in the same way? And parents felt really challenged by how to keep their sort of logical argument and explain it to their kids in a way that felt caring and empathetic. And I think that could be an intervention point in helping parents think about the various ways that they sort of hold on to their values and explain their values to their children. I think that for me, an intervention point also feels like parents feel so strongly that they want their children to have experiences with people who are different from them, but can't figure out how to do it or why it's important or how to talk to their kids about it. And I feel like that desire is in and of itself an intervention point, and helping parents like sort of validate that, like, yes, this is important to you. Now let's think about how we can do that in a way that's going to be meaningful and authentic and not voyeuristic, because they're asking for that. So that seems like an opening. Any other questions? Yeah.
The last section was really interesting to me in the sense that you kind of set forth some very, you talked about what are the good implications for good parenting vis-a-vis this topic. And I was just wondering, in your research, are there other things that you've noticed in terms of healthy habits that you didn't articulate in that last section that was noteworthy? Mm-hmm.
Healthy habits that would be related to having these kinds of conversations about parenting?
Interventionist or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so the core of what we do at Making Caring Common is around, like, how do you help kids be caring for other people, concerned about people who are different from them, and committed to the greater good. And I think a lot of the parenting strategies and tips that we talk about related to building empathy and helping kids be caring in general are specific, can also be specifically relevant to having conversations about class privilege. So we talk a lot about helping children acknowledge and appreciate those people who go unnoticed and go invisible in our daily lives, and thanking them and being grateful for the contributions that other people make to our daily world, right? So thanking the bus driver, thanking the people behind the cash registers, thanking people who hold the door open for you, and noticing that everybody is contributing to our community. Another one that we talk about is helping children expand their circle of concern. So it's very unlikely to find people who don't care about anybody or who aren't concerned about anybody else besides themselves. But most kids and most people are mostly concerned with the people who are in their most immediate circles. So we talk a lot about how can we help kids understand and be more concerned about, be more committed to, and feel a greater sense of obligation to people who are outside that immediate circle, and how can we broaden that circle? So it includes people who are in our broader community, people who are really different from us, either because they have different experiences or different backgrounds or really different ways of thinking. Kids who have experienced different challenges and struggles, and maybe people we've never met and might never meet, but to understand that we are somehow connected to them and that we should be concerned about them as well because they're part of our larger community and our larger society. Yeah.
So this may be a sort of detail that's forthcoming in the report, but I'm curious, just hearing you talk about that broadening of circles, and then also the kind of the list of suggested or potential interventions. That they're all quite abstract kind of concepts about how to have these conversations, and it seems like one of the major reasons potentially for that is that a child who is going to be able to have very different conversations than a child who is 18, and but still that the details, it seems like, would still matter and be very important, and that you would still learn something about that even though they're not universally applicable. So I'm curious if like there is thinking about some sort of matrix of what these interventions mean at different ages, as opposed to kind of the high level kind of abstract description of it.
Yes, I think that the specific language and the situations that arise do vary some by age, right? So I don't think you can explain systems of power and oppression in the same language to a 4-year-old that you can to an 18-year-old. But I think you can explain the core sort of fundamental idea, and that kids of all ages understand and connect with a sense of fairness and justice, and that they see that playing out in their lives in very age-appropriate ways. So I can imagine there being, as you said, sort of a matrix in terms of language that gets used and specific words, but that the fundamental ideas and principles are similar across the age range. And similarly, I think when parents were talking with us, the things that their kids notice are different by the way or by the age of children as well. So, you know, younger kids are going to talk more about the toys that their friends have. Older kids are talking more about the vacations that their friends are going on and what they're seeing their friends post on social media, although that's starting earlier and earlier too. So I think that there are ways that it varies and also very concrete things. I also think another place where it varies a little bit by age is in the school setting, and parents feeling differently about the schooling opportunities that their kids have preschool, elementary school, and then middle and high school. And again, depending on the way that communities are structured and the schools and districts are set up, parents feeling that they have more or fewer choices at different age groups, and that they're concerned about how those issues play out in a school setting very differently in an elementary school than in a high school.
Thank you so much.
Thank
That's all
you.
we have time for today. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Feigenberg, for coming out today. And, thank you all for coming out today.
How do we make our feet strong and healthy? So I think the best thing we could do is if we started out as kids and didn't put shoes on and wore open-toed sandals and really let our feet develop as much as they could, I think that would be the best thing.